Welcome back. Our next lesson is on use cases and architecture components of data integration. In our last lesson, we talked about the ETL and ELT processes and how analytics connects to each one of these different pieces in order to obtain useful data. Let's break it back down in order to talk about how we get useful data from a architectural standpoint. There's essentially four phases. The first step is ingest, and that's going to collect data from any source into the centralized store, which is the second step. Store is going to be the storage of your data sets. And depending on the appropriate data store, it's going to be an architectural decision. Mainly the type of file formats that you want to store and process. The third step is prep and train, where there's going to be exploration and preparation techniques in order to try to solve business problems. The last step is model and serve, and that's the analytics piece where end users can consume and build custom reports. Let's take a look at some use cases now to see how Azure handles each one of these steps. Our first use case is for real time analytics, where we're essentially on the number one spot using sensors and IoT devices, as well as clickstreams and events, all unstructured data to be ingested using Azure HD Insight. There, it moves into Azure Data Lake Storage and Azure Databricks to store and prep and train, where it's modeled and served using Azure Cosmos DB for real time apps, or used with Azure Synapse Analytics, formerly known as Data Warehouse, where it's used by analysis services that are also used by Power BI in order to deliver those custom reports. On the structured custom app side, we're ingesting using Azure Data Factory and storing in Azure Data Lake Storage prior to going through the prep and train phases with Azure Databricks and modeling and serving using Azure Synapse Analytics. Our next use case is big data analytics, where we can have logs, files, and medias or unstructured data, as well as structured data from business or custom applications. In any case, it will be ingested using Azure Data Factory, moving into Azure Data Lake Storage, stored using Azure Data Lake, prepped and trained using Azure Databricks, and modeled and served using Azure Synapse Analytics and Analysis Services, Azure Cosmos DB, and Power BI. Finally, we have stream analytics, where we have streaming data that is ingested through Azure Event Hubs. It's stored in Azure Blob Storage because it is all unstructured data, and it's prepped and trained using both Azure Stream Analytics, moving into Azure Cosmos DB, Azure SQL Database, or Power BI. For each of the steps, there is a primary architecture component. For ingestion, we have Azure Data Factory, Azure HD Insight, and our Events Hub. For storing, we have Azure Data Lake, Azure Synapse Analytics, which is also formerly known as Azure Data Warehouse, and regular old blob storage. For prep and train, we have Azure Databricks and Azure Stream Analytics. And finally, we have Model and Serve, which is also once again Azure Synapse Analytics and Azure Analysis Service, Power BI, and Cosmos DB with consumer based apps or custom applications.